Let's man the battle line today and talk through every single army in Warhammer 40k's base troops. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're not talking tanks, war machines or elite infantry at the vanguard of your forces, but instead going to be focusing on the basic battle line troopers and talking through each army's choices and how relevant they are in competitive games right now. Just in general, I feel like there's often been a bit of an issue with keeping the grunts relevant in Warhammer 40k gameplay in the past. In general, I feel like Games Workshop has an idea of an army that they'd like players to roughly have as the optimal sort of army that they could play in game, and that idea doesn't usually tend to be just literally 100% elite damage dealer type squads, even if they might like the idea of being able to build around them as their own thing. But in general, I think what they want to encourage is at least some troops in an army with the standard battle line of an army, which means that they need something to draw you to them above other things. In general, the troops don't tend to be the best damage dealers in the past. That is kind of expected though, most of them tend to be armed with small arms that are generally effective against lighter infantry, though not too much more than that. And if the troops choices did tend to be the absolute best damage dealers out there, there wouldn't be as much point in going for elites or heavy support with big guns, so you would expect the troops not to be quite as good at those for destroying the enemy army. As a result of that though, to make them relevant they have to have other advantages, usually focusing around objectives or other utility or perhaps synergy within an army. In 8th edition with the detachment system, command points were basically tied to troops, given that you needed to fill battalions to get command points essentially, and the same idea was kept with 9th edition, but flipped around a bit so it was more like if you didn't have the battalions then you lost CP rather than the other way around. On top of that, to make them super relevant for the scoring game, which ultimately does win games, they also gave them objectives secured, a pretty huge special rule that meant that an individual model could hold out an entire objective against entire squads of enemy elites. It definitely meant that they were powerful for that role, but it did seem a bit odd occasionally when you could have, say, one Ork boy hold an entire objective against 10 Space Marine Terminators if the stars aligned and he didn't die first. It perhaps felt a bit all or nothing as a rule. In 10th edition, they've really quite reinterpreted what they were doing in 9th, but have still kept things along the same sort of theme. For most armies at least, troops don't tend to be the best damage dealers, and the only thing that the battle line keyword actually gives you objectively is the option to take 6 squads of the unit. Sometimes that can be relevant, though for most armies they still often tend to prefer to take their base troops in smaller numbers for the utility that they bring. It's not really an advantage to be able to take 6 of a unit that isn't really all that good. Otherwise, for the themes for the troops units, they tend to have objective control 2 compared with elite units that have objective control 1, so they're still better but aren't quite as ridiculously more powerful than before. And Games Workshop really seems to have tried to make most of the troops relevant with their actual special rules for sitting on objectives. Some of the battle line units that you'd expect to be a bit more aggressive get things like wound rerolls if they're targeting enemies on objective points, really quite big damage boost there, or get the kind of helpful sticky objectives rule, or all sorts of resource farming abilities, sometimes even gaining CP for sitting on objectives, or helping out individual factions with various ones of their own unique resources. In general, I'd say it varies very heavily from army to army, though most armies do run at least some battle line units regularly in their competitive lists. It kind of feels like they've left themselves in a situation where they're going to have to balance things carefully with every single army, and perhaps argue that some of their troops are being executed a bit better than others. Say for example, I could have seen Plague Marines being a bit better to have one of those objective type special rules when they just got a bit of resilience to battle shock instead, which wasn't quite as exciting. In any case though, let's talk through every single faction in the game and how relevant their troops are in competitive armies right now. Starting out with the poster boys, and for the Space Marines, perhaps the most common ones that I've seen in competitive lists are Intercessors and Assault Intercessors, out of the core codex at least. Intercessors are nice enough for their 85 points at time of recording, small arms that are good enough to bully enemy lighter infantry, a power fist in melee, and perhaps the biggest draw being their sticky objectives rule. Quite a lot of the units that we'll talk about today do have that. I feel like it's often one that you might want, say, one copy of in an army, but otherwise, unless there's big draws to the units beside that, you don't necessarily need much more than that. Both these guys and the Assault Intercessors as well can be kind of okay to guard certain characters, seeing as almost every single character can join them, and they're pretty cheap. The Intercessors are quite nice for if the character wants to sit on a home field objective, where the Assault ones can be nice if they're going a bit more adventurous and want to do some melee damage, as the Assault Intercessors can potentially buff the character by getting full rerolls to wound against targets on objectives. That could be quite good for a fancy captain with a power sword. Otherwise, the Assault Intercessors are just quite nice for having close threat at range and being very cheap. A pretty ideal expendable squad that can repel enemy lighter infantry. Otherwise, for the Space Marines, the heavy intercessors don't make their way into competitive lists quite as much. I feel like they're in a bit of an awkward place where they're actually genuinely quite good at a more casual level. They do have pretty massive defense stat lines for the cost, so they just have the issue of just costing a fair bit more than an intercessor squad that could have really done the same job as them, as seen as an overinvestment by many. In lists that aren't super completely hyper-optimized though, I think they do their job absolutely fine, and I do quite like the Anvil Siege Force if you happen to be playing that one. Otherwise, tactical squads I think just really need help. There's basically not much to draw you to them. A last cannon and a special weapon hidden in a 10-man squad just isn't enough, and their special rule is kind of what other squads can do already by fielding them in fives. Overall though, in most optimized lists, Space Marine armies just tend to run troops very sparingly, if at all. Perhaps partly just due to Marines having tons of competition for that battlefield role. Scouts are rather good for taking points up the board, and infiltrators are very nice for being flexible and being able to do that, and having their big deep strike denial bubble, which make them pretty ideal home field objective holders. Otherwise though, a few of the other Space Marine chapters do have their own battle line choices. I feel like the Black Templars are easily the most standout of these. I think you could argue both of their squads are a bit undercosted, perhaps the Firstborn Crusader squad more so than the Primaris though. 65 points for 5 Space Marine bodies with a built-in las cannon, melter gun and power weapon is pretty crazy, and they'll really like the Ironstorm Spearhead for rerolls on that big las cannon shot. These are definitely so good that they're just regularly spammed. It's really hard to go wrong with that many objective control 2 bodies with a bunch of las cannons thrown in. They can both be durable chaff and also legitimately threaten enemy tanks. Otherwise, the Primaris Crusader squad I think is absolutely great at 14 points per model. Loads of bodies that can take buffs well, such as the Feel No Pains from Grimaldus or the Turnhouse's Bones. Really nice and righteous Crusaders, and most chapters can't get Space Marine bodies for anywhere near this kind of cost, even if a few of them do have some slightly lower saves. Scout is quite a nice advantage as well for making their way towards the midfield. Otherwise, for the Space Wolves, Blood Claws and Grey Hunters are options. Blood Claws feel kind of similar to the Primaris Crusader squad in their own way. Mass bodies at a very cheap points cost with bonus strength and attacks on the charge. I feel like a unit of them with Ulrich the Slayer for some big rerolls and more against heavy stuff is absolutely great. Again, a fairly tough chaff unit with a bunch of objective control that can hit surprisingly hard in combat. Grey Hunters I think are kind of fine, but maybe just a bit less standout. I'd certainly rate them over the tactical squad. Otherwise, the Death Watch get their veterans. Death Watch are maybe having a bit of a tough time of it right now, and they could probably deserve to go down in points a bit, but I would say that they're one of the most interesting units in the index. Heavy Thunder Hammers plus frag cannons and things are rather nice. If you want a big maximal investment unit for the Death Watch though, they would be competing for the Proteus kill team with its Terminators built in. If you're going around huge combos, that might well be the better option, but I think their veterans are definitely an interesting datasheet. Otherwise, with the new Dark Angels Codex, you can also get Outriders to be a battle line unit in the company of Hunters. Unfortunately though, at least with current 95 points at time of recording, they're just too expensive to be bothering spamming I think. I guess maybe could be okay with a Ravenwing command squad with the advance and charge enhancement. That could give you really quite a big unit that could move 18 inches and then charge. Though I feel like they're probably going to struggle to compete against Black Knights. For the Imperial Guard, and they've got a fair few battle line choices, 4 different flavours of infantry squads. These have definitely seen a shake-up since the book first launched, the Deathcore Creed being kind of standout, but now they're the most expensive a bit less so. I'd actually rate the Kaschan Jungle Fighters plus the Deathcore as kind of joint top at the moment. The Kaschans are definitely inferior for damage point of view, but are arguably better for defense given that they're 55 points for 10 of them, even if they don't get the medic. The big thing that the Kaschans get though is the scout keyword, which is just kind of excellent for securing midfield objectives, perhaps particularly in chimeras with heavy flamers, and they do give you the option to take Iron Hand Strachan as well, who's just an absolute beast for the amount of points that he costs and can genuinely threaten a lot of heavier infantry. Otherwise, if you're building around infantry as core damage dealers, the Deathcore of Krieg are hard to ignore. They can get 3 special weapons per unit, which is rather nice, a nice damage boost if the unit's injured but not destroyed, plus 1 to hit and wound on their special weapons makes them genuinely fearsome. They can access a Marshal for 5+ Feel No Pain, could take a Psyker for a 4+ Invulnerable, and they get their Deathcore Medic to allow you to regenerate D3 models in the unit if they're damaged but not destroyed. In general, for the most part, the Guard take their infantry as more support for the big heavy guns and tanks. Certain skew do like to run heavier amounts of infantry though, and can definitely surprise some opponents. There's far more people having success with more mixed hybrid Guard lists and things like big tournaments though. Otherwise, Scions can be battle line if you take a command squad to lead the army, though in general more people tend to field them not battle line and just take some units to drop for some special weapons or doing secondary objectives. And otherwise for the other infantry squads, I'd also rate the standard infantry squad as kind of good. It is just handy to have some las cannons that can reach out and threaten some enemy tanks a bit more. They get guaranteed cover while on objectives as well, so they're quite nice for a home field squad. I'd say it's probably the Cadian shock troops that actually have the most struggle for a niche right now currently, just maybe a little bit middling compared with the rest. Next up for the Adeptus Custodes, at time of recording they really are struggling a fair bit in game. Weirdly enough, I'd probably rate the Prosecutors as perhaps their most objectively strong battle line datasheet. You can get 4 models for 40 points, which is just pretty excellent for being a cheap unit to do secondaries or score primaries for cheap if you can screen them. They don't really do much damage with a flurry of bolter fire, so in general you typically want some but not loads for that role, and it's quite nice that you can have some cheap units running around to support all the Custodes that have far higher costs per unit, which makes them a bit clunkier for doing grunt work. I'd probably weigh them up against upgrading for Witch Seekers for a bit of Flamer Fire up close. That could be a reasonable upgrade if you want it. Otherwise, the other battle line unit is Custodian Guard themselves, kind of a unit that they sort of need to be strong, but in their current form I think that Games Workshop have just overcosted them a bit for what they really do. Perhaps part of the reason that Custodes are placing at the absolute bottom of tournament rankings right now. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with their rules though objectively, and if GW chose to put their points back to where they were, they'd be really quite strong again. They've got really solid scary stat lines with their Guardian Spears, big rerolls to wound against units on objectives, which make them a lot more general purpose and can threaten to shoot twice once per game. Currently I'd say their main issue is competition versus the Custodian Wardens and the Allarus Terminators, Wardens with their big defense and the Allarus with being more threatening against heavies. For the Grey Knights, the unit of rate top would be the Brotherhood Terminators. Again, they tend to be pretty much the backbone of the army. Squads of them teleporting around the board, accompanied either by Drago or Librarians for some Vortex of Doom action. And while they do have some competition for the Paladins, it seems that these guys are a bit more widely played. They're a bit cheaper than those guys. They get to resurrect a Terminator per turn with the Apothecary, which is a big deal. And their special rule is to get lethal hits on the charge, which is very nice given that Grey Knights often struggle to deal with big tough enemy tank profiles. I feel like they pair particularly nicely with Grandmaster Drago to hopefully give them a delivery for that charge out of Deep Strike with his +3. Otherwise, for their power armoured troops, I feel like the strike squads are still often present in most competitive lists, often just taken as a single unit to put their sticky objectives rule to mark the Grey Knight home field objective until another unit can take it, and then it means that they could move on guilt-free to another objective if the opponent's not in range with it. And with an army with the teleporting tricks that Grey Knights have, it's pretty powerful to be able to allow that objective just to remain yours if the opponent can't reach it. Next up for the Adeptus Mechanicus, it'd be the Skitarii Vanguard that I rate as best. The Codex is maybe one with big winners and losers, but the Vanguard do seem to be a staple in just about every competitive list. If they can stay alive, then they're really quite great objective holders, given they've got OC2 and make the enemy OC -1, which means that they should pretty much always take the objective if you put them on there, the opponent usually having to wipe out the unit if they want to take it. The damage isn't terrible for cheap troops with their special weapons. If they have a marshal leading the unit, say in Skitarii Hunter cohorts, then it gets better, and they get even more damage output boost if they jump out of Scorpius Dune Riders, a very nice way to get them onto the midfield objectives quick and give them reroll to wounds when they get there. Otherwise, the Admech battle line boosts other units nearby, particularly the Cataphron Breachers with their big rerolls to hit, so if you are building around them as your core damage dealers, you basically need a battle line unit to back them up. And as mentioned, they're a pretty interesting unit for Skitarii Hunter cohorts, where they're often fielded with multiple squads backed up by the enhancements, and in general seem to be one of the best ways to take midfield points as Admech. Comparatively, I'd say that Rangers at the 10 points more that they cost just aren't quite as standout, often still used but maybe in smaller numbers for their sticky objectives, rule and scout. Otherwise I feel like the cheaper Vanguard generally win out. I guess they do have some slightly longer range small arms which could help out on occasion. The Adepta Sororitas only have the one battle line choice in the Battle Sister squad. The Novitiates don't get battle line at the moment. At the current points cost, it does seem that they do get used in some more competitive lists. I've seen the occasional list that has just chosen to go very heavy on the Battle Sisters themselves and manages to make it work at tournaments. I feel like they're maybe not one of the most obvious units to use out there. For the investment, you get a bunch of sisters in power armor, and perhaps their biggest draw is the fact that they can manipulate miracle dice quite so well. Multiple ways to farm or refund them within the unit, and they can do some fairly crazy things with a single multi-melter within melter range, and then feed in miracle dice with some sort of combo of the Palatine Dialogus or Triumph of St. Catherine. One multi-melter or even melter gun within melter range could cause some surprising amount of hurts to enemy heavies if the miracles guarantee that you get at least one auto wound. Moving on, we have the Imperial Knights, which again, like the Custodes, are generally a bit underpowered at time of recording. For best battle line unit, I would give it to the Armored Warglaves. Pretty strong anti-tank shooting with those thermal spears, fairly nice general purpose melee with a combat boost when they charge in. And these guys do just generally tend to be a strong battle line for the army, fast, good objective control, and a bit more expendable compared with the big knights, so they're typically used on the front lines to screen and deal a bit of outlying damage. Otherwise, I'd say the Helverins are kind of fine, good enough backed up with certain bondsman abilities, like the Crusaders one to get them hitting on twos, and maybe a nice one to have on the backfield objective. The autocannons are great against certain targets, but less so against others. Their low AP does limit them a little. From Forge World, the Armored Moiraxes are a bit on the pricier side, but not awful with certain weapon options, particularly as the other armies just went up. Finally, for the Imperium, we have the Imperial Agents. They do have a couple of battle line units of their own in the Adeptus RBTs and the Navy Breachers. A bit weird in the way that they have the battle line keyword, given that in most normal armies you can only take 3 or less units anyway, though I guess it might have interaction with the Inquisitors and things. I feel like Games Workshop deliberately tries to keep these units niche compared with other choices out there. When the Exaction Squad got very good, they radically changed the rules on it, meaning that you had to take 10 of them and bumped up the cost really high. And now on the whole, these two just don't really compare particularly well with things that you can get in your own unique army, and will usually have less synergy due to not having stratagem support and things. I'd say if you come to the Agents of the Imperium looking for cheap chaff units to do actions and objectives and things, the choice will be the Inquisitorial Henchmen, but they don't have the battle line tag, so I guess maybe aren't as relevant for this video. I guess it's kind of relevant here that Inquisitors can join and buff battle line units that we've talked about so far. For certain combinations, that could be exactly what you want. Things like Kyriadraxus could be interesting to shield units from shooting at greater than 18 inches. That's not an ability that many Imperial armies have. And there's some interesting anti-psyker choices from Greyfax, and some somewhat punchy melee and other benefits from Kotias. I wouldn't rate the Inquisitors as enormously standout for their cost, but some lists do take them. Moving on to Chaos, and first up we have the Chaos Space Marines. The Chaos Marines are doing very well at the moment, and both of their battle line units in Cultists and Legionaries do see regular tournament play. They're usually in kind of small numbers, maybe in the region of 1 to 3 units per army list, to provide some cheaper units and objective support to an army that already has quite a lot of cool damage dealers. The Cultists are really quite cheap with the sticky objectives rule, which is pretty nice to be able to buy in for so cheap a cost. Not bad at all for a very expendable unit. And Mark of Nurgle can give them some cheap opportunistic hiding if it's absolutely critical that they don't get shot off an objective. They do have at least a little bit of threat from their special weapon shooting, though not much. Otherwise, Legionaries are often fielded just in units of 5 with a las cannon and heavy melee weapons. Quite nice to have as a bit more of an expendable chaos threat with some higher objective control. Could be a good follow-up unit to move their way onto midfield objectives after the first wave of elites have gone in. And they can certainly threaten some massive damage against enemies in the midfield, getting their wound rerolls against things on objectives. Otherwise, you can also take the Cult Marines as battle line datasheets, so things like Khorne Berserkers or Plague Marines out there. I feel like their datasheets are kind of okay, but don't feel as standout within Chaos Space Marines, not getting their faction rules. Out of these, probably the ones that I'd rate highest would perhaps be Warp Flamer Rubric Marines. Good objective control and fairly big overwatch, plus they don't really lose much from not being in Thousand Suns. Otherwise, they do have a few other cultist-style units, particularly accursed cultists don't have battle line themselves, but often tend to be some of the chosen objective skirmishers. You can get a lot of bodies that heal themselves disturbingly quickly, and can be very threatening when they charge in when they trigger their special rule. For the Blood-Soaked World Eaters, I would rate Khorne Berserkers at the top. Again, fairly often run in competitive lists, though tend to be in at least somewhat small numbers, though I have seen a couple of lists go all in and spam loads of them. They aren't quite as good general purpose damage dealers compared with things like 8 bounds that they compete with, but still bully like light and medium infantry really quite effectively, and when they're moving up to midfield objectives, Blood Surge could genuinely be problematic for some gunline armies. You can't just walk an infantry unit up next to them and then shoot the unit to death, not unless you can kill them all in one go with one round of shooting. Perhaps one of the biggest draws to run them is escorting some of the really quite good characters out there, like Khan or the Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive. Even Khan isn't quite as likely to take out his own Berserkers compared with what he used to be. Otherwise, when they're on those objectives, their icon can allow them to reroll some blessings. Runners work well to get them there. and maybe something in the region of a couple of small squads with characters often is the way that people choose to go, mounted in rhinos. Otherwise, jackals or wood raiders are a touch more niche than the Space Marines themselves, perhaps taken in smaller numbers yet than the Khorne Berserkers to access their sticky objectives rule. Can be a nice home field objective camper, and if the enemy does try and sneak up on them with chaff, they can be surprisingly brutal in melee, should easily be able to hold their own against any enemy light infantry. For the Death Guard, the Plague Marine battle line seems to be a way that quite a lot of people play the army list in general, and they're maybe one of the few troops that really seem to work well as genuine core damage dealers for the army. They are kind of crazily cheap for the special weapon and gear that they get at just 16 points per model. I've seen lots of lists that do well that go very heavy on them, taking mass squads of 5 and occasional squads of 10. It's not too uncommon to see lists using 30 or 40 Plague Marines out there. In those squads, they tend to be tooled up for melee, lots of heavy plague weapons and bubotic weapons, maybe some plague spewers or other special weapons to support them. And then joining the units are some of their great support units, most notably the Biologist Putrefier that amps up their damage to pretty terrifying levels, as well as contributing some of his own grenades. But otherwise, things like the Foul Blight Spawn or perhaps the Tallyman are definitely usable as well. Rhinos can get them up there into battle and counteract their slow movement, and they currently seem to be cheap enough to be the featured heart of the army. It's definitely a recipe for them being taken in droves if they're as cheap as they are and pretty dangerous, as well as being a unit that wants to march forward and has objective control too for when they get to fight over points. Otherwise, Poxwalkers and Cultists aren't battle line in 10th, so I guess the Plague Marines don't have any competition for best battle line here. Poxwalkers are maybe a bit more niche, 50 points for a cheap chaff squad. I've certainly seen some people running them in 20s with Typhus, which is fun. A sort of a mix of zombie horde plus one very dangerous character spewing mortal wounds. The cultists are perhaps a bit more niche still, maybe okay if you want some absolute minimal objective presence. Kind of similarly for the Thousand Sons, the Ruber Marines definitely are a central unit of the army, and are certainly used en masse to accompany powerful sorcerers that the army likes to spam. They are a fairly solid datasheet in their own right, getting a 5+ invulnerable save and some okay small arms fire. In general, I'd rate the Warp Flamers as a fair bit stronger compared with the Inferno Bolters, both of which are fairly dangerous with a little bit of AP. Plus they can have a Soul Reaper cannon per unit for a little bit more heavy firepower. The sorcerers can all add interesting things to their unit, things like the Umbralific Crystal teleporting them around, or the Infernal Master boosting their shooting output, or the one that can shield them from harm from 18 inches, which could be quite nice for a home field objective, and Rhinos are usable enough to get them where they need to be. Lots of Thousand Sons lists tend to go really quite heavy on the rubrics as a result, and there are definitely units to make the battle line keyword relevant, often people taking more than 3 of them. The Zangors, on the other hand, people don't view quite as favourably. Chief Birdmen chaff with really quite good objective control and the ability to reroll battle shock tests. I feel like perhaps these guys are a little bit overshadowed due to the way that people like to build Thousand Sons to really focus on those Cabal points. I probably wouldn't go too heavy on them and trying to make them into primary damage dealers or anything like that, but for chaff troops I don't think they're that bad at all. The invulnerable save and being able to skirmish pretty well with other light infantry does them well. For the Chaos Demons, I'd certainly argue that the standout battle line choice are the Nurglings. Unless you're playing Mono Gold Chaos Demons, they're pretty standout enough to be used in just about every army in my opinion, and kind of show their value just by how many armies choose to ally in the Nurglings as well. Just because they're very good at winning the secondary objective game, having units that can infiltrate to start up the board to do secondary objectives, or just screen and hold back the enemy, or dropping via deep strike into, say, the corners of the board, or other areas to do things like deploy teleport homer. Otherwise, the core datasheet isn't really going to do any sort of meaningful damage compared with other choices, but they do debuff enemies with a -1 to hit, which is nice, and that could be really quite meaningful if they are just being nuisances all over the board. And for their cost, they are at least fairly tough as well, a bit more so than most armies would generally want to bother trying to deal them with. I have seen some armies just go very heavy on them for board control and fairly godly secondary support. I feel like 2 or 3 units are rarely going to be a bad choice for an army. Otherwise, for the demons, the lesser demons don't tend to get played quite as frequently. Lots of lists include at least some, though maybe not going too heavy. Horrors and Plague Bearers are both pretty nice little tar pit units for holding objectives, generally soaking up a fair bit of enemy fire, the Horrors with their split. Bloodletters could be an interesting unit for jumping on the enemy out of their close range warp strike, maybe having a bit of competition with the Blood Crushers for the damage dealers that you might want to do that with though. Demonettes I'd still say could probably do with coming down a point or 2. They're pretty fast with good objective control and do hit with a flurry of attacks. Maybe a squad could be okay with a Transweaver perhaps. For the Chaos Knights, they're perhaps one of the armies that goes heaviest on battle line units, given that the competitive way to play them is basically spamming War Dogs and pretty much nothing else, unless until Games Workshop chooses to adjust the points. It's pretty common to see competitive armies being literally War Dogs en masse, maybe with a few Demons in support. Out of the War Dog choices, the Brigands and the Carnivores seem to be the most standout, and both of these are kind of commonly fielded as allies as well, particularly Brigands and other Chaos armies to provide fire support. The Wardog Brigand is just a very efficient gun turret for 160 points, ballistic skill 2+, with its thermal spear equivalent to get big anti-tank damage with Melter 4, a chain cannon and havoc launcher to make a mess of some infantry. They get bonus AP when they shoot the nearest unit, they've got fast and have got good objective control, and maybe could be an alright target for the focused firepower stratagem that Chaos Knights have, where you get multiple ones trying to take down one big threat. The Wardog Carnivore got perhaps a surprisingly big points decrease last time Games Workshop looked at the numbers. 140 points is just very scary for these guys. Pretty dangerous melee with a choice of attack profiles depending on what you're fighting. Even faster than the Brigands and are good to re-roll charges so can threaten a long way. And terrain isn't as big an issue for them as other places due to their access to their walk-through wall stratagem if they desperately need it. They're pretty handy for pushing the whole dread range thing up the board as well and getting more enemy units likely to fail battle shock. Out of the Knights, I'd rate those as the top two. The mixed role ones are kind of fine, like the Huntsman and Stalker, though maybe not quite as standout. I'd probably rate the Executioner and Moirax as a little bit behind the curve compared with the rest of them. For a general purpose gun turret, I prefer the Brigand by quite a bit. Next up, despite the Aeldari being really quite successful in recent times, Battleline doesn't really seem to be a part of that. The vast majority of tournament placing Eldar lists often tend to run absolutely zero troops, and neither Rangers nor Dire Avengers are part of the equation for the Eldari troops anymore. They got moved out a while back. I'd say if I had to pick one unit, I'd probably go for the Guardian Defenders. Farseers are really quite powerful units for boosting nearby stuff, and that could mean that you've got a nice support retinue for them so they don't just get gunned down with some trivial ignores line of sight firepower. Plus they can farm some fate dice if they're sat on an objective, and chip in with some heavy firepower with a single bright lance shot, which makes good use of the Eldari rerolls. Between all that does seem quite nice for a home field objective, even if they aren't still super commonly played. Otherwise, the Storm Guardians I have seen played occasionally. They've got the sticky objectives rule, which is nice enough, though I feel like their damage output is pretty poor for their cost. Probably a unit that could go down in cost or Games Workshop make more dangerous. And besides that, the Harlequin troops could become battle line with a troop master, maybe aren't awful for skirmish units and transports, but aren't particularly favoured within the craft worlds at the moment. And Corsair Void Reavers get some okay damage dealing against enemies on objectives, though are fairly expensive and a bit mixed purpose, and still not that tough. I feel like the Eldar being not that tough is perhaps the biggest issue with these guys. Most of these just aren't really the units that you'd want to be putting on midfield objectives to be giving and receiving blows, given that they're going to be shot down fairly easily. Eldari armies tend to make much better use of Wraith Guard for that role to stomp up towards the midfield, often a big unit of 10 with a Spirit Seer. For their Dark Kin, the unit I'd rate as highest will be the Kabbalite Warriors. Hopefully Drukhari will get some boosts in the upcoming balanced data slate, but the Kabbalites do seem to be the unit of choice for taking midfield points from either Raiders or Venoms, and they have quite a nice special rule with sticky objectives that functions within those transports as well, so they don't even need to get out to lay claim to a point. Their damage output really isn't too bad given their weapons choice and access that they get. They've got a fair few special weapons plus a Dark Lance within the unit, and one squad of them could be a retinue for an Archon to allow his Ruin a Stratagem type thing, plus the rerolls that he gives the unit as well. He does make pain tokens pretty efficient for them, and his unit could be kind of scary. Otherwise, I'd say that Racks are still pretty interesting. A small unit, a little bit tougher per model, and can fill a similar sort of role. They still have perhaps surprisingly heavy shooting given their special weapon access. Witches currently, I'd say, are a bit underpowered, maybe not quite general purpose enough for their damage output for people to want to take them. Maybe one squad with Lilith Hesperats could be interesting, as she does help to alleviate their weaknesses. For the Tyranids, I'd rate the Gargoyles as a truly standout battle line unit. The Wing Swarms are just excellent objective support, really quite good nuisance skirmishers with deep strike and their move shoot move ability, meaning that they could come down out of deep strike and then get really quite close to the enemy, potentially getting into unusual positions for secondary objectives, or potentially even being lucky enough to swipe primary objectives as well if the opponent hasn't screened them properly. A unit could have potential for a really big first turn move block as well if it made sense to, Being able to move up the board quite so quickly means that you could have a big line of them right outside of your opponent's deployment zone from turn 1, which could be really big against certain armies that couldn't go around or through them. In general, most lists tend to take at least some, though don't tend to spam them too much. Otherwise, for the Endless Multitudes units, there's Termagants and Hormagaunts. Out of the two, I'd rate the standard Termagants as slightly higher, solid enough damage output with Spine Fists with their big twin linked rules. These seem to be the staple unit in the unending swarm detachment that gets used the most, though Hormagaunts are quite good there as well with their melee things. Hormagaunts are just very fast moving with advance and charge built in, plus a whole load of AP-1 melee attacks. They're not really going to be threatening anything much more than say standard Space Marines at a push, but mass attacks could certainly bully weaker units. The majority of Tyranids lists seem to go a little bit light on the troops and swarms and things, maybe 1 or 2 units of gargoyles, perhaps some termagants with their reactive movement things. But it does seem that in Unending Swarm specifically, just mass Tyranids on the table can be competitive, even if it is a bit of a skew list and a spoiler build. Maybe having something in the region of 100 to 160 odd gaunt bodies between gargoyles, termagants, and hormagaunts, plus a bit of support from things like lone operatives and some heavier damage dealers to handle tough stuff. Otherwise, neither the Tyranid warriors nor the Neurogaunts are battle line. Tyranid warriors I think aren't too far from being good, can have okay damage output against the right targets, but perhaps just a little bit overcosted for their defensive profiles right now. Neurogaunts can be interesting enough cheap chaff in the backfield. You do get a lot of wounds for the points, even if they won't really do anything on the damage front. For the Genestealer Cults, they're perhaps one of the armies that gets the most damage dealing out of their battle line units. They have a big emphasis on battle line units, both the Neophyte and the Acolyte hybrids. Some of the best units to support with stratagems and character boosts, and also respawn really quite easily as well. If I had to rate a best one out of the two, I'd probably give it to the Neophyte hybrids. There's a whole load to draw you to those guys. For Guardsman equivalent profiles, they can be incredibly strong damage dealers with Deep Strike, jumping in with the primers to reroll all hits. The buffs that you get out of Cold Ambush, plus things like stratagems and Ridge Runners to take all those seismic cannon shots to the next level. And then when they get there, they're a big hoardy unit with a bunch of high objective control, and they can respawn things with their cult icon in the unit. Never mind if the enemy does wipe them out super fast and they come back. They also get to farm command points if they're sat on an objective as well, which is kind of nice to have them guard the home field. Never mind any objectives that you can find for them up the board. The Acolyte hybrids are pretty much on the same level though still. They're most commonly run as sort of bombing run squads with 4 demo charges out of Deep Strike, and then using the 3-inch deployment stratagem to get them in on something that they need to blow up. Their mass hand flamers that the rest of them can get can certainly chip in as well, and can hit clear hordes quite nicely, and again they can take most of the same sort of damage boosts as the Neophytes can. Kind of threatening if they do get to respawn as well, as they can potentially replenish their bombs. That is rather nice. For the Orks, for the best troops choice, I'd probably rate the Beast Nagger boys there. They've only got them and the normal boys. Gretchen aren't any longer classified as battle line or troops, though I feel like if they were there, then they'd definitely be in the running for their objective command point farming, plus just being spectacularly cheap for a whole load of cheap wounds on the board. Between the two sets of boys, I'd probably slightly rate the Beast Nagger boys over the regular ones, though again, probably not too much in it there. You do pay 20 points more for the Beast Nagger boys, and that gets you a little bit of bonus strength, feel no pain, and a monster hunting special rule compared with the standard ones, plus some slightly different character options, such as the option to take the Beast Boss, who certainly can punch up against big tough stuff that can be one of the challenges for Orky army lists. They're perhaps particularly nice jumping from trucks where they get a bunch of OC and should bully most medium infantry units quite well, and at least be a little bit more threatening against enemy heavies if that's what they need to try and take out. With that though, I really wouldn't diminish the normal boys as well. I don't think that they're quite as dangerous, but they do cost a fair bit less, plus they get the option of the standard war boss in the unit rather than the beast boss, and he's great as well, not quite as good at punching down heavy hitters, but spectacularly cheap. And for them I'd be tempted to still run them with the choppers as a close combat unit, particularly with the Orky detachment that they've got at the moment. For the Necrons, their 2 battle line choices are Immortals or Necron Warriors. Out of the two, there's really not too much competition between them though. The Immortals do seem to be solidly on top as per Games Workshop's latest rules. Their Tesla carbines in particular are just pretty brutal for stacking masses of wounds on whatever they want to shoot at, getting 4 reroll wound rolls against units on objectives. Gauss is definitely usable as well, though I'd probably rate it as second to the Tesla in most builds. Can be a bit better if you're expecting a lot of high armor and 2+ saves, I guess. Otherwise, they've just got lots of good units to support them, things like Overlords, Plasmancers, Chronomancers, or Luminor Zeraz, who can do some fun AP things with them. And they're one of the units that can make some of the best use out of a bunch of detachment synergies out there, say attaching a Plasmancer and getting reroll all hits in Canoptech Court, teleport tricks and the rerolling hits one with Hypercrypt, +1 to wound and obeisance, and quite nice support in Awakened Dynasty with a +1 to hit for characters. Despite strong competition for the Necron frontline with things like Wraiths, they still seem to be appearing in some of the strongest army lists around. Otherwise though, at the moment I'd rate Necron Warriors as kind of badly balanced really. Less damage, and Games Workshop did them a bit of a disservice by taking their big reanimation rules away from them. They are perhaps a little bit more durable than the Immortals overall, but the difference isn't huge per the cost, as at the moment they'd either need a rules boost or to go down in points a bit further if they were going to compete a bit better. For the Leagues of Votann, I'd guess they'll probably get a bit more of a range expansion sometime in 10th edition, though for the moment they just have the Hearthkin Warriors. They're fairly sturdy with toughness 5 and a 6+ feel no pain, come with a bunch of special weapons and the sticky objectives rule to mark points to be held by your army until the enemy gets them. At the moment though, I would rate them as perhaps one of the more underpowered units out of the Votann small index. They do get played in competitive lists, though I think it's quite often more to get the Sagittars on the board than them necessarily. They just seem to be a unit that's vastly stronger in Sagittars compared with not in Sagittars right now, and perhaps even more so because those transports allow you to split the unit in half, and that can give you the cheapest units that the Leagues of Votann have to offer, as otherwise the next cheapest I guess is individual characters running around. Definitely still usable enough, though it seems that people like to put them in transports a lot in more optimised lists. Finally, for the Tau Empire, there's the Breacher team and the Strike team. Out of the two, it seems that the Breacher team is currently the strongest, usually being deployed in Devilfish as perhaps one of the easiest Tau ways to take the midfield objectives in an army that doesn't really have all that much that really wants to be on the front line. The Devilfish can move them forward and get them within their short pulse blaster range. Then you get a whole bunch of Strength 6 AP1 damage 1 shots that get to reroll the wound roll when you're trying to gun something off an objective, and the Devilfish help them out a bit, as well as giving them stratagem support as well. The Cadra Fireblade can be a pretty reasonable extra damage boost for the unit as well, making them even scarier. Maybe the downside is they can be quite fragile to any sort of counter-attack, though one volley of these guys, if they're shooting fairly optimally, could well kill something of a similar sort of points level to them. Otherwise, the Strike team are a little bit lesser played, not awful to hold a home field objective, maybe with an Ethereal in them if you're not playing Farside Enclaves. The Ethereal maybe feels like the biggest draw to them, giving them both a 5+ feel no pain and allowing a bit of command point farming to go on through the game. I'd probably look at them in slightly smaller numbers though, and for the Devilfish choice, the Breachers seem to be the way to go with their boosted gun stats. The Recruit are no longer Battleline in the current index, though I suppose that might change in some way with the Codex that's coming out. I guess either with one of the characters or with the new detachment that they get, there'll be a good chance that they can be fielded as the battle line in kind of their own mini-army. Currently though, I'd rate them as alright, a cheap scouting unit with a little bit of close-range melee threats to fight off their peers. Not really all that tough though for being on the front line. And with the Xenos armies talked through, that brings us to the end of each army in 40k and a rough impression of each of their troops units in the game at the moment. Let me know your thoughts for your own faction, how would you rate their troops choice at the moment, and I'll look forward to hearing any other insights or other ways to use them that I might not have listed here. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.